Welcome. My name is Cheryl Hickey. I am an administrator of accreditation here at the Commission. I am joined by a few of my colleagues, and I want to thank you for taking some time this morning to talk about the Common Standard submission process. And we hope that we are able to clarify a lot of your questions this morning and make you feel at ease about your upcoming submission on the Common Standards. So I'm going to turn it over to each one of my colleagues to introduce themselves today. Meanwhile, I'm going to make sure that you are not seeing my children on the screen.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jake Schuler. I'm a consultant here at the Commission. I'm the Red Cohort consultant, so you've probably heard from me by email. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. I'm Erin Sullivan. I'm an administrator here in the Professional Services Division along with Cheryl, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. This is Michelle Bernardo. I'm an analyst for the Professional Services Division as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Poonam Bedi. I'm an assistant consultant also in the Professional Services Division. Thank you for joining us.
And then finally, we will be joined by Terry Clark, who has been called away momentarily, but she will be joining us a little bit to help with this webinar. So I want to thank you again for joining us this morning. All of you have Common Standards due on February 28th, so I know you're probably pretty anxious to either get started working on them or to continue working on them and to make sure that you have what you need so that you have a very successful accreditation site visit. So we're hoping again to be able to clarify all of your questions, and we would like to let you know that on the screen or on your computers through the Zoom, you should be able to use the chat function to go ahead and send some questions as we go through. What we plan to do is we're going to mute all of you so that we don't have a lot of background noises. So go ahead and send in your chat question. It would be really helpful if, as you write your questions, if you would refer to which of the Common Standards you're asking the question, if there is one. If not, it's fine too, if it's more of a process question. And then what we'll do at the end is we'll come back to the questions, go through those, as well as then open it up for any other questions. So we will unmute you at that time. So we want to just get started. We're going to go through standards 1 through 4. We're going to start a little bit about the process, and then we're going to go through standards 1 through 4, and then we're going to take a little bit of extra time on standard 5. It is the standard that is sort of the newer concept, or at least part of it is the newer concept, and we've had probably the most questions about Common Standard 5. So we're going to share with you, Poonam has been really great in looking at what the other institutions have submitted over the past couple of years for Common Standard 5, and we want to share some of those things with you so that it gives you some idea about what you might be able to use for your submission on Common Standard 5. We are going to record the webinar and we will be putting it on YouTube because YouTube also does closed captioning, and then it will be available on our Common Standards webpage for any of your colleagues that may have missed this morning and want to get caught up. Okay, so I think we will jump into the slides. So just to start off with a reminder about what I'm wondering whether I should change this thing. I'm sorry, because it's right in the way. There we go. There we go. What's that? No. Oh, you are. Okay, got it. Okay. So I wanted to remind you about what the Common Standards are, because I think it gives you a good perspective as you go about, submitting more of the nitty-gritty information about, each standard. So there are over 40 some odd types of credential programs that are unique and different. Everything from a preliminary teacher preparation program to your PPS programs to school nurse and many, many, many added authorizations. And each of those has their own set of program standards. But what the Common Standards are a set of standards that are common regardless of the type of program that are offered or the number of programs that your institution offers. And they really serve as the foundation for ensuring that an institution has the capacity, the resources, the expertise to offer educator preparation programs. So they serve as the foundation sort of for all of your programs. So there really is one set of common standards for every institution, and Michelle will talk about that in a minute. And all institutions are subject to the same set of common standards regardless of, which programs you offer or how many programs you offer. And they carry significant weight. So when you ultimately have findings at a site visit, the common standards, if there are findings, tend to be a little bit heavier than some of the really more minutia or specific program standards, and they tend to result in some stipulations if there is a finding. So you want to make sure that the information you provide on common standards is pretty solid, and that you can show that the institution is very supportive, very attuned to the kinds of things that you need to do to make sure that you have that solid foundation for offering educator preparation programs. It can be a little challenging, and I know some of your questions might be, it can be a little challenging to understand the role of common standards when you have one program versus when you have many programs. When you have many programs or multiple programs, we're looking at sort of trends across the programs. When there's one program, it gets a little confusing to say, okay, is this a finding in clinical practice for the program, or is this a finding that rises to the level of common standards? So we will work with you to figure that out, but right now all you need to worry about is your submission process. So I think the purpose of the common standards, just going through this, they apply to all of the institution's commission-approved educator preparation programs and really address quality and issues of institutional infrastructure. So things like I've been mentioning, resources, governance, leadership, quality of preparation. So I'm going to turn this over right now to Michelle to talk about the review process.
Good morning. So the Common Standards Review occurs in the accreditation cycle in year 5. Cheryl mentioned there is only one set of common standards that represent, and it represents and is inclusive of all credential programs offered at the institution. We also you must submit your common standards on the website where you hold your preconditions and program review documents as well. Next slide. Okay. We ask that you do not submit any long narrative. We should see supporting documents and short narratives. This should provide enough information for the review teams. We have the evidence guide also posted on our Common Standards website, so please use that. These the evidence guides will help you with what's needed for each common standard, what you should submit, such as the candidate handbooks and advising materials. And below that is the Common Standards email address, Common Standards Review at ctc.ca.gov. And again, the Common Standards are due by February 28th. The Common Standards Submission Review is only reviewed one time by the BIR team. It is anticipated the Common Standards reviewers will be some of the same readers who will read the program reviews, and from this group, the site visit team will be selected. Your Common Standards will only be reviewed a single time. Any standard that's not preliminary aligned will require an addendum 60 days prior to the site visit, and that should be posted to your website as well. Finding on each common standard will be made by the team at the site visit. So finding for each element of each of the common standards will be made by the team at the site visit to determine if it is consistently met, inconsistently met, or not evidenced. And then the site visit interviews and review of evidence will confirm common standards are being met. And Cheryl will go over that just a bit more.
So just all of you have gone through the program review process and received your feedback. And you will remember that. Oh, not yet. We'll be receiving your feedback soon. Sorry about that. And so you will probably recall the same similar process in that we prescribed or said exactly what kinds of evidence we want to see. When you receive your common standards feedback, it will be based on the information that you provided. And there will be, as Michelle had mentioned, a finding of preliminarily aligned or a series of questions or things that the review team needs to see. You really, please do not feel like if they're not preliminarily aligned that is a problem. That is not a problem. There is no consequential finding at this point in time. This is really your recipe for what the review team or your site visit team needs to see prior to the site visit. So you'll want to really embrace the addendum process by submitting any information that the team has asked for that they could not find during the common standard review process. The standard, the feedback form is provided to you on a standard by standard basis. It looks a little bit different than you'll get with your program review. But essentially, what you want to do is take that information. Do not feel bad if things are not preliminarily aligned. Again, it really is a real opportunity to make sure that you're able to address all of the questions that the review team has 60 days prior to the site visit team arriving at your institution. So it is different than in the past. In the past we would go back and forth and there was, you got to the point of preliminary aligned. That is unlikely to happen now. And I don't want you to have unrealistic expectations. It's fine. It is just fine. And things have worked out very well. It gives you a lot of information that you are ready to hit the ground running when your site visit team gets there. I'm going to now turn this over to Erin.
Good morning. So I'm going to start what we're going to do for the next, few minutes, which is sort of walking through each of the common standards, standard by standard, and kind of covering what it is that the standards are looking for and going over the evidence that we're asking for and kind of how that's applicable. And as Cheryl was mentioning, similar to with program review, we have a guidance document that specifies what evidence we're looking for in your submission. A little different than program review. The evidence that we're asking for common standards is standard by standard, whereas in program review, of course, we asked for 7 elements. For preliminary programs, 6 elements if you're induction, and those elements were meant to provide sort of a broad basis for determining preliminary alignment. With common standards, we have identified specific pieces of evidence for each of the components within each of the common standards. So let's get started looking at that. And of course, we'll start with Common Standard 1. So Common Standard 1 with 12 components is really the most dense standard that we have, with kind of a broad range of topics, although they're all related to institutional infrastructure. So with Common Standard 1, we are looking at how is the unit set up in such a way as to support all of the programs within the unit so that those programs can all be successful and really thrive within the unit. So just quickly, I'm going to go over these components. Of course, we're looking for you to tell us about the vision of your unit and the programs that are within the unit. And is that vision consistent with preparing educators for California Public School Service? We're going to look at the involvement of your faculty, your personnel, and the stakeholders in your education community, and how the institution is involving those folks in programmatic decisions. Is there a feedback loop? Have the faculty and the stakeholders, for instance, been involved in the process of developing the vision for the unit? We will be taking a look at similarly collaboration of the faculty and the institutional personnel with your broader educational community. That collaboration hopefully extends to different entities within your community in order to really help the program be as strong as it can be with a lot of good input. How is the program collecting feedback, for instance, about itself, about the program from a variety of stakeholders, not just alumni, employers that you interact with, and other individuals within your community. Basically, how is your program ensuring that there's a broad view, a broad amount of feedback from the stakeholders within your service area? Then, of course, we're going to be looking at whether or not the unit is providing sufficient resources and support to ensure that your program is successful. We'll be taking a look at your unit leadership. If you need sort of to understand what unit leadership is looking at, there is a definition of that in the Common Standards booklet. This element hopefully is demonstrating that the leadership in your unit has the authority and support to address any issues within each program. We'll be also looking at diversity and excellence within your unit and within the programs within your unit. And in this case, we're referring to recruitment, selection, and retention of diverse faculty and personnel. And we're also looking at, though, what are the efforts that the unit and the programs are providing around supporting the ongoing sort of professional development of the faculty and the personnel in terms of providing support to your candidates who are going to be working with diverse California K-12 students. What kind of development and training opportunities are you offering to your faculty and your instructional personnel so that they can best support those needs of your candidates, the candidates in your various programs? We'll be looking at the qualifications of your personnel. This particular component of Common Standard 1 really speaks to those individuals who are teaching your courses, who are providing professional development, who are supervising your field-based experiences and your clinical experiences. We'll be looking at the kinds of criteria that you're using to recruit and support those individuals. There is a component, of course, within Common Standards 1 around your credential monitoring process. So what is your institution's process and guidelines around ensuring that only those candidates who have met all of the requirements for your preliminary programs are recommended for a credential? And those are going over those components of Common Standard 1. So let's dive in then a little bit about what evidence we're asking for. So we'll be looking for a vision statement. And again, if you want to follow along, I am using the Common Standards guidance document, and that is available on the Common Standards webpage. If you don't have it in front of you right now, that's just fine. But these things are provided in that document as well. So we'll be taking a look at your vision statement. You'll be providing us a brief description, so about 500 words or less. If you go over by a little bit, that's fine. But again, as my colleagues had mentioned, we're trying to move away from narrative-heavy submissions and really get at the kernels of evidence that really show what your program is doing. But in this particular case, your vision statement will come to us 500 words or less, and it's going to show the research base for the vision of your programs and how is that consistent with preparing California educators. We will be asking you to submit to us a table, and that's going to show us the kinds of activities that your stakeholders and your instructional personnel and faculty are involved in terms of demonstrating that active involvement within the community. we are asking for you to provide to us any published policy documents that you have. So there's a, sort of a listing here of some examples of those: faculty handbooks, professional development training handbooks, any kinds of guidelines, tenure policies, anything that demonstrates how you're ensuring that your faculty and your instructional personnel do continue to be involved in that larger stakeholder community and gathering that input and staying abreast really of what's going on in your service area. Next slide. Additionally, we're asking that you give us documentation around your efforts for hiring and retention of your faculty. We are asking you to provide us with job descriptions for your faculty and your instructional personnel. Any qualifications that are required within that hiring. You're going to share with us blank evaluation forms for your instructors, your professional development folks, your field-based supervisors, etc. And then finally, we will be accepting another short narrative, which will be a description of what your credential monitoring process is, again, to ensure that only those candidates that have completed all of the requirements are being recommended. Now, in lieu of this, 200-word narrative, or maybe in addition to, you may have, for instance, a handbook that your credential personnel use, or a checklist or something that shows what the requirements are and what they're walking through. So if you have something like that, you can submit that rather than a narrative as well. That's you've got some flexibility there.
This is me.
I'm sorry.
Oh, excuse me.
I was behind the slides as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Jake, and Jake's going to walk you through the next few standards.
All right. So we're moving to Standard 2, Common Standard 2. As much as I love Common Standard 1, Common Standard 2 is my favorite, I think, because we're moving from, how is the unit set up? What are the structures of the unit overall? And now we're looking at who are the candidates within your program. So Common Standard 2 is, again, looking for evidence of these things. So the first bullet says the unit accepts applicants for its programs based on clear criteria, and it's multiple criteria with multiple measures. So we want to know, how are your candidates selected? How do they get into your program? And how are they aware as to what those measures are? So we want to see evidence of somewhere where the public knows, what do you need to do to get into your programs? The second part, this goes back to the part that Aaron started with about the diversity of schools and students and faculty across California. This one is focused more specifically on your candidates. So how is the program purposely recruiting, admitting, and supporting these candidates? So I get questions sometimes from programs that say, we're really small, we haven't been able to grow our numbers, we come directly from maybe an undergrad population that has a similar feel to it. So perhaps it's the support part, right? Support for you, it might be on the support side, but the conversations around who is coming into your program have happened, even if the numbers don't necessarily reflect that year to year. We still want to know, what does your unit talk about? How do they decide how this is going to happen going forward to make sure that that candidates are admitted that continue to reflect schools in California? The third bullet is the clearly identified personnel and information for advisement. So we want to know, where do candidates go for help? Who are the folks that are on staff or in faculty that candidates go to and rely on for knowing how to get through the program, and if they're struggling, who they can go to. The last one is the process to support those candidates who need additional assistance. We also want to know, how do you identify those candidates? So do they fly under the radar, or do you have a set policy for how to make sure if there are candidates who are struggling, you're able to get to them and get them the supports that they need? You'll see that, I think this will be on the next slide, but there's a number of spots for this standard where you're not submitting evidence during the Common Standards submission. And as Cheryl and Aaron have said, so for these, information has come in program review. The Common Standards reviewers will see comments from the program reviewers for anything that may have been possibly a question during program review. And so you may still see comments, you will still see comments for Common Standard 2 and 3, even though there's quite a few places where you're not submitting new information directly for the Common Standards. So again, here's the evidence required. Links to the admittance requirements for each program, candidate recruitment materials, this may be on websites, a brief description of that advisement and assistance process, and then the actual list of who are these people they're going to, and who helps also with advisement and placing candidates. Please.
I just would like to mention here again that, for instance, on the third bullet, a brief description of your candidate advisement and assistance. Again, this may be a place where you have a handbook, where all of your candidates receive a handbook, and within the handbook, they are informed of what kind of support and advisement that they'll receive throughout the program. So if you have a document or a piece of evidence, feel free to submit that if that makes more sense than the narrative. That's absolutely acceptable.
Okay, great. Let's move to Common Standard 3. So there's a lot of language here. Up front, realize that for Common Standard 3, what you're submitting is nothing during the Common Standard submission. So do a quick recap of the standard, but the information that the reviewers will use is information that has come from program review. So you're not worried about submitting anything specific to Common Standard 3 at this point, but you will see comments back on this. And as Cheryl mentioned, don't take the comments in a negative fashion. It's a great way to have the conversation with your consultant and with your team early on, so that by the time they show up, there's been a chance for you to reply to those things, and they'll be able to see them at that 60-day before the site visit time period. So again, Common Standard 3, all about the course of study, fieldwork, and clinical practice. So as it says here, we want to make sure that your candidates are experiencing diversity in their placements. So we want to make sure that if you have candidates that you know are placed possibly at a student teaching placement that you believe does not show them that diversity, that you've found ways for them to see other classrooms, that they have other opportunities within the program to see diversity within the program. Making sure that those supervisors are certified, experienced, making sure there's a process for that, for the selection of the site-based supervisors. You may get a question back if during program review, it looked like possibly the schools or the districts are completely making that decision without the program sort of overseeing it or really knowing what that process was. There's often questions about, what is that process to make sure that we have the right supervisors with the right candidates. That fourth bullet says the supervisors are trained. Of course, this is different in every program. My mind sort of goes immediately to multiple and single subject programs, but this is a common standard. So across all of your programs, what does that training look like? The next bullet says programs effectively implement and evaluate fieldwork. So how do you get feedback on the experiences that your candidates are having and on how your supervisors are doing with your candidates? The last bullet, again, significant experience in school settings where the curriculum aligns with California standards and frameworks and the school reflects diversity. So according to the type of program you have, there should be language also within the program standards, making sure that the sites that they're at are with the standards that need to be addressed during the program. Okay, next slide. And this is your reminder that nothing as far as evidence is submitted for Common Standard 3 at this stage. Back to Erin.
Before I jump into Common Standard 4, I just maybe would like to provide, if you're feeling maybe a little anxious or a little nervous about not submitting any evidence during Common Standard 3, and we have said that evidence has come in during program review, I just would like to kind of cite to you, if you've done, all of you have done program review, but just to remind you some of the things that you submitted during program review and why those apply to that Common Standard 3. You gave us your course sequence. You did that very extensive course matrix for us where you talked about where how and when the competencies are introduced, practiced, and assessed for all your candidates. You gave us fieldwork and clinical practice evidence, et cetera. So I think looking back at what was submitted during program review, it probably makes good sense to you why we're not then asking for sort of redundant information or for you to duplicate that information again in Program Standard 3. So yes, so moving on to Common Standard 4. So this is the continuous improvement standard, and this common standard has carried over from our previous common standards. It continues to be a really important and very valuable common standard that demonstrates to us how you as a unit are monitoring in a very systematic, very regular way what your programs are doing. So how are your programs gathering information? How are you as a unit then looking at that information, making decisions about where there may need to be some program improvement, acting on those decisions, and then reevaluating, were those the right actions? Have they resulted in some program improvements, or do you need to sort of reevaluate that? So you'll be really taking a look at multiple sources of data. Some of those sources of data will be provided, for instance, by us. For instance, we'll be sharing survey results with you, et cetera. But some of that obviously will also be data that you're gathering within your own programs. And we're not overly prescriptive about what that data should be, but through the Common Standards review, and then also again at the site visit, we'll be looking at what are you gathering? Does that make sense? Is it useful to you? And then how are you making decisions based on that? And how are you involving, of course, your stakeholders and community partners in the evaluation and analysis of that data? Next slide. So helping us to understand how you're doing this, we're asking you to share with us a graphic depiction of your unit assessment cycle schedule that includes the personnel in the unit and in the programs that are involved in that. What are their roles? Where are they involved? What are their responsibilities? And what are those assessment activities and how are they occurring? We are asking that you provide us with an annotated list of the data that you are using in your assessment cycle. And we will be reviewing that information along with information now that we are gathering through our annual data system. So those are data submissions that you are making each year through the ADS that really are providing us with a big sort of global look at what your program is, how it's offered, who your candidates are, and some assessment data. It will also include survey data, that I said, that some of which the commission will provide to you, and then, of course, additional assessment data. Now, moving on to Common Standard 5. For Common Standard 5, I'm just going to go, I'm sorry, did you? Okay. I am going to, as I have with the other common standards and has Jake also, sort of review what's required and how it's reviewed. And then I'm going to turn it over to Terry Clark and Poonam Bedi, who are really going to get into what we mentioned at the beginning of this webcast, which is what have we started to see has been submitted to us over the course of the last couple of years as part of our sort of newer cycle, and kind of delve into what kind of evidence we're hoping to see and how we're going to move forward with that. So Common Standard 5 was a newer common standard, of course, when we revised the common standards a few years ago. And in this way, the Commission was really looking for programs to start to talk about how they are evaluating the impact that they are having in the education community in the K-12 schools in California. So we're going to be asking you to demonstrate to us how you are ensuring that your candidates know and demonstrate the knowledge and skills that are necessary to educate and support all the students in the California K-12 schools effectively. And for that component of Common Standard 5, you'll notice when you look at the Common Standard submission feedback, we're not asking for additional evidence. A lot of that evidence is going to be gathered through that really dense program matrix, where we are looking at how you are ensuring that candidates are introduced to the competencies that they need, where they're practicing them, and how you're assessing that. So for that particular component, we're not asking for additional information, and your Common Standards reviewers will receive some feedback from program review, because those folks will have really gone into your matrix in a very deep way. The second component of Common Standard 5 is around how you as a unit and your programs are really evaluating the positive impact that your candidates are having on the learning, on teaching and learning within the K-12 school settings. We go to the next slide. And so the evidence that we're going to be looking for is a description of how you know that your candidates are having a positive impact. You're going to be providing us again with some narrative and some evidence. So what we've seen over the past couple of years is a lot of data coming in, and that's fantastic. But what we need to go along with that data is some narrative that talks about, what does that data mean? Why did you gather it? Why do you think it's important? And why do you think it's demonstrative that you're meeting this particular common standard? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry and Poonam, who are going to really walk you through that.
Good morning. The camera did not come. The camera's coming to me now. Okay. So Common Standard 5, as Erin said, the first part is something you've been looking at for years. You've made sure your candidates have the knowledge and skills they need to have to get the credential they're going to be earning. So the second part of Common Standard 5 is the part that's actually new. And so we're taking just the program impact sentence from Common Standard 5, and we want to help you break it down. And then at the end here, we're going to give you some examples of some data we've seen. So first off, we want you to notice that this is also about how is the unit evaluating and demonstrating its positive impact, and how is each and every program within your unit evaluating and demonstrating that it's having a positive impact. And then we want to break it down even a little more if we go to the next slide. You know that the commission and the staff and then the team at the site visit looks at all the language in the standard. So this is exactly that sentence, the second sentence in Common Standard 5. And I have intentionally bolded a number of words that I really think you want to look at. So the unit and its programs. So you got to keep two things in your mind right there. Evaluate and demonstrate. To me, that sounds like this idea of program impact is somewhat looked at in the way you look at everything else related to Common Standard 4. You're collecting data, you're evaluating it regularly, you're deciding what else you might want to do about that data. So you may want to think about adding this program impact idea into your continuous improvement loop. What is it that they're evaluating and demonstrating? They're looking for a positive impact. Now, positive impact is a very broad term, and we're allowing you to really apply it as broadly as you would like. And this is the part, originally we talked about Common Standard 5, especially the second sentence. It's like having the free space in bingo. And I want to say, no, it's not really that open. It's not a free space. You don't get it free no matter what. What I want to say is that this positive impact is like having the blank in a Scrabble game. You can look at the positive impact in any number of ways. But you do have to look at the positive impact specifically on a couple concepts. Candidate learning and competence. That one should be pretty easy because you're already having to do that for every credential program before you do a recommendation for every candidate. And the first sentence of Common Standard 5 says you have to do that. So really for me, what's new in this standard is this last phrase. A positive impact on teaching and learning in schools that serve California students. Teaching and learning in schools that serve California students. It doesn't say only public schools, so if you work with private schools, that's also an acceptable area for you to find this evidence. But so I think the crux of this for me, this second sentence, look to figure out how you can gather data, articulate what that data says to you, and how you see it having an impact on candidate learning and competence, but especially on teaching and learning in the schools in California. Now, it makes a lot of sense to think about that in a local geographic area because we're not expecting you, if you're in the northern part of the state, to be impacting Southern California schools. So we'll think about this logically. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Here are some questions you can consider as you develop your data and your narrative that you will submit with Common Standard 5. What does the information from the program completer survey convey to your unit and the programs about your impact on candidate learning and competence, the teaching and learning in schools? How are you using the information from the survey in regards to program impact? This has a lot to do with the first part of Common Standard 5 and that first part of the second sentence. You should be able to articulate pretty easily here, and you may even have done some of this earlier in some of your submissions or in your program submissions. It is not just acceptable to submit the survey on its own. The survey by itself doesn't tell a story. It is numbers by itself. What lessons can programs within an institution learn from one another in regard to program impact? The Commission's standards have often pushed institutions, programs, and broader than the education unit in some improvements. The continuous improvement loop that the accreditation system started requiring every institution to have thoroughly embedded starting in about 2008 has really broadened to full institutions. The regional accreditors are looking at that same type of a continuous improvement loop now. Well, that's a way to get programs to talk to each other. There may be something in your institution where some program has some really great things that they're doing that other programs could say, whoa, we could do that a little differently, and we could get some really good data from our program. So please talk across your programs within an institution. And what lessons could a program learn from other institutions and stakeholder groups? What we're going to be able to do here at the Commission is be ready to broker some of that conversation once we have a little more of this data. We still only have a minimal amount. Let's go to the next slide. There are both, and we're going to talk about this, internal and external evidence examples. And we're starting here with some external ones. And this is where you really need to think broadly. Think outside that box. How can you make that Scrabble letter make some really amazing words? So what does institutional leadership do to support teacher preparation? As an example, I was at a CSU where the president of the university was very adamant across the university that this is a teaching university. We're here to teach students, and we're here to prepare future teachers. That was part of the motto. That was part of the conversation that was shared with the community. Institutional leadership also. Maybe you are a university and you have speakers come to your campus. Now, it's not just the fact you have an engaging speaker come, but maybe you have set it up that your completers or your district employed supervisors get either free or reduced price tickets to that speaker. That's something you should be documenting for Common Standard 5. Any workshops you put on for local teachers, a district may ask you to provide some expertise in a specific area, inviting local teachers to workshops and professional development activities on your campus. The employer survey, that is fairly new still, and it really only applies for the preliminary teaching programs, but that is definitely external to your program. So you're going to want to be thinking about these external sources because you're going to want to balance external and internal information. Any teacher preparation grants that have been awarded to your institution, whether it's from the state, from the feds, from some philanthropy, that's an impact to the schools. Literacy programs, or like in the speech language pathology world, those programs often run clinics. That's an impact to the public schools and the students in your area. If you have a lab school or professional development school, professional development programs, and in many of our institutions, especially with preliminary teacher prep programs, you often continue to interact with your completers years after. And it may have to do with some data of how many of your district employee supervisors were former candidates, how many of your university supervisors were former candidates, but document the ways in which you as an institution and your programs continue to connect with, provide resources for, and serve and interact with your completers and your graduates. So there's some ideas that we've seen about external evidence that you might collect. Looking to internal evidence, you know a lot of this already. Your candidate, administrator, supervisor, mentor, alumni surveys. You know about internal program assessments, program examinations that you are using to evaluate the candidate's knowledge and skills. That pretty much takes care of the first part of Common Standard 5 and the part of candidate's knowledge and skills and competence. Narrative and anecdotal evidence, such as some formal observations, the ILP topics for induction programs. If you were to take and make a list of all those topics and how many candidates are working in what areas, and then had some anecdotal information about impact. I've heard situations in induction programs where an induction teacher has decided this is a focus, and that focus didn't end at that end of that inquiry cycle or that year even. That focus may have enlarged and become something that a grade level or a school continues to focus on. Document that type of situation. That is an impact in the schools. Professional development activities. So I think we've talked about that pretty much. I'm going to turn over to Poonam for how do you organize your submission and some examples that we've seen.
Thank you, Terry. So again, these are just suggestions on how you can organize your information for this submission based on what we've seen over the past few years. So one thing that you can consider is providing your narrative at the top of your webpage for your accreditation website. And that narrative at the top of the webpage really serves as a description that contextualizes the data that you will be providing as part of your submission for this program impact standard piece of Common Standard 5. So underneath that narrative, you can provide the data that is specific to your program or your programs. And with the data, it would be helpful for your readers to see a brief description of what that evidence is and the links to that evidence. And again, for your program or for each program if you have multiple pieces of evidence. Information that's more specific about what is required, again, is in the Common Standards Requirements document that Erin was referring to earlier, and that information is also on slide 18 of this presentation. Okay, another example. I'm sorry, no, go back one, sorry. Thank you. That's okay. Another example format is one in which you embed data into your actual narrative, and you would do so by using hyperlinks. A reminder is that when you are gathering your data for your submission, it's important to understand that not only do you need the data and the links to the evidence, but you also need the narrative. This standard cannot be fully met without both the narrative and the data to really give your readers a picture of the positive impact that your program is having. Next slide, please. So again, these slides are just examples of what we've seen with submissions over the years. You are free to organize your information as you see fit to your program or programs. And on this slide, there is a breakdown in chart format of evidence that we've seen examples of being examples of evidence that we've seen being submitted, a brief description of what that evidence is, and hyperlinks that take the reader to that specific piece of evidence. So in the first row, we see perhaps your institution has received some sort of grant from the Department of Education or from the state or some sort of organization in regards to teacher preparation. The second row is a piece of evidence regarding the employer survey. So perhaps you survey the employers and you follow or perhaps you keep track of your candidates once they have completed your program to get a sense of that positive impact that is being had in the local community that you serve. In the third row, math and reading tutoring programs. Perhaps at your institution, you have your candidates interact in after-school programs where they provide tutoring services for various subjects, or perhaps you have something on campus or you partner with local institutions, you have something that's happening specific with a program or multiple programs. This is your opportunity to really showcase what is that positive impact that your institution is having across its program and its programs. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Cheryl as we wrap up the presentation part of this webinar.
So one of the things I want to add on Common Standard 5, it is a new concept, relatively new over the last couple of years. And I always think of it in terms of Common Standard 4 is the process for collecting, analyzing, and making program improvements. So it's the process, and how do you make those program improvements based on the information that you have or the data that you have. Whereas Common Standard 5, I look at it in terms of what are the results? What does your data say about who you are as a program and as an institution? And what are those things that have resulted as from some of your things? So as I look at this chart in particular that Poonam has prepared for us and looking at other things, I think, when you talk about grants, it's not that you've gotten, $5 million in grants. It's what have you done with those dollars? So through this grant is almost the end of that sentence is almost the most important part of what you would submit. What have you done? Have there been, some programs set up at your local schools with your candidates, those kinds of things. So I think it's really important that you just highlight those things and how you are involved in classrooms or in schools, and through your candidates, through your professional development providers, through your instructors, those kinds of things. And that's just how I make the distinction between Common Standard 4 and Common Standard 5. But we wanted to, of course, you have a number of questions that we want to get back to. And this last slide is just the list of some of our resources, of course. And you always have your cohort consultant that you can email with PSD and then whatever the cohort is at ctc.ca.gov. And so we're happy to answer your questions. But I think what we'll do is we'll go through the questions. As I just perused them really quick, one of the questions that I see coming up a number of times is when will you get your site visit consultant? So I wanted to address that right at the beginning. So we are right at the point in time where we start assigning those site visit consultants. So if you have a fall visit next year, we will get you your site visit consultant very soon. If it is in the spring, you have to remember our consultants are working on this year's accreditation site visits. So we will probably announce those right after the first of the year. So I just wanted to make sure that you know that we're working on it, and we will get that information to you ASAP. So I don't know how you want to do. Great. And thank you for, I see that you've highlighted the standards on the questions as we've asked on a number of them. So thank you. So Jake, go ahead.
Yeah. So I've got the list of questions that's come in by email before and also during the chat. One final point too on Cheryl was talking about assigning the site visit consultant. Because they're working on their visits for this year, I wouldn't wait for them to complete this submission either. They will be a resource once you're doing an addendum for your actual site visit down the road. But at this point, you should prepare this submission with the help of PSD Red at CTC questions and also from what you've heard from us today. Okay, so the first question was about that the site visit contact person. That's called the commission consultant. The second question came in by email earlier, which was what do we do for those common standard elements that it says don't submit any new evidence. We've talked about that a number of times. So you're not submitting anything, and you do not need to link to the program review either. You can just leave that blank for evidence. Erin, yeah.
Yeah, so this is Erin. I'm working on coordinating program review and working with the program reviewers. And so I will let me sort of reassure you by providing you with a little additional information. Program reviewers are asked not only to provide you with feedback about preliminary alignment or more information needed based on your program review submissions, but we also ask those individuals then at the end of the day, after they've taken a look at all of those elements that you've provided for program review, they complete a little bit of feedback that specifically goes to the Common Standards reviewers in the spring when they do your Common Standards review submission. So program review folks, while it's all still fresh in their brain, go through the specific elements of the Common Standards where you're not resubmitting, and they provide some feedback for their colleagues in the spring. So that information is sort of pushed forward. Now, with that being said, because your Common Standards review is coming in on what is going to become your accreditation webpage and already has your preconditions linked on there and your program review submission linked, if the Common Standards reviewers feel like they kind of want to dive in a little bit and maybe look for some things, they actually have access to your program review submission. So if they want to go in there and look for some information, they can do that. Also, it's important to remember that even though you're not submitting evidence for a specific common standard or some specific components of a common standard, you're still going to get feedback from the Common Standards reviewers on every common standard and the components within every common standard.
Okay, great. Thank you, Aaron. All right, so to the other questions. These are some questions that were submitted before today. So from Common Standard 1, where it talks about the research-based vision of teaching and learning, the question was whether or not you should pull directly from your institution, something that they already have posted or have sort of set out there as their vision, or whether it should be a narrative created solely for the educator preparation programs. I'll take a first stab at this question that it really needs to be something that's adopted by your unit, by the educator preparation programs. Of course, it may have some components that cross over from the institution, but it should really be a statement that represents all of your programs, specifically for educator preparation. All right. The next question, still on Standard 1. Really good question here. I've heard this a lot. So the component says, this particular part of Standard 1 says, the unit ensures that faculty and instructional personnel regularly and systematically collaborate with colleagues in P12 settings, college and university, and members of the broader educational community. If you are a district, that's the oh, sorry. Can you provide some examples, was the question. Yeah, thank you. So the question was, what are some examples of how we collaborate? So if you are a district or an induction program and your focus is mostly that you're in P12 daily, you're probably thinking about the part of the sentence that's more on the college, university, or other broader educational community outside of that world, right? So the idea here is that the decision-making, the feedback loops for your program is not all internal. The standard is asking, how do you reach out to a broader community and involve other stakeholders to get data back to you about ways to improve? So on the other hand, if you're an IHE, if you're at the university level, this might be, how are you involving, and systematically, not just sporadically involving them, but how are you systematically involving schools, P12? We know that you have MOUs, we know that you're engaged with them, but how are they involved systematically with you?
I think on that particular thing, the bottom line is to remember that what the COA wants to look for is making sure that your program and your unit is not insular, that you are really meeting the needs of your local area. And that means you need to get out of yourself and ask and know what's happening either in the schools, or if you are a school district, that you are working with your your higher ed feeder, so that there is a true community of educators in your area. So bottom line.
Great. Okay, the next question also about Standard 1. This is, again, can you provide some examples for the component that's about recruitment and faculty development efforts supporting hiring and retention of faculty who represent and support diversity? So I know we went through this one, but I think it's important here to remember again that this is not about counting numbers of who your faculty is and what they look like and how they represent diversity. That may be a component for you, that you're talking about that and the successes that you've had in recruiting and retaining certain faculty. But this is also in supporting those faculty to know how to support diversity. So examples could be, meeting minutes from specific advisory board or leadership meetings that you've had an agenda item on that meeting about this part of your efforts. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say I'd like to put an emphasis on something that Jake said just now, which is meeting minutes. Often we're provided with agendas,
right.
And the agenda is nice. It shows us what you're planning to discuss, but the meeting minutes really demonstrate what was discussed and if there were some decisions made, et cetera. So the meeting minutes are really valuable.
But they're not necessarily the only thing. There could also be like recruiting materials,
Yes.
initiatives that the institution may have to go out and seek additional hires. Those kinds of things I think are important. And I'd also I know that second-tier programs like induction programs always have this question around this one. So I'm going to ask Terry to share this.
So in the second tier program, where your candidates are people that are employed in your entity and or your partners in the entity, it makes it a little more complex. And the Committee on Accreditation does understand that. So they're not expecting you to go out and find more diverse candidates than people who are employed in your area. And they're not expecting you to find much more diverse supervisors. They're not really supervisors, but mentors or coaches, because the mentors or coaches that are available are the people in the district. Some of the things you can do is you can look at the diversity information for your candidates, your mentors, coaches, your teaching population as a whole in that LEA, and your student population as a whole. You can also look at what efforts are the employers making to hire more diverse educators. It's kind of it's a big mix there, because even though the entity is approved by the commission as an educator preparation entity, that educator preparation entity is embedded inside an employing entity that employs educators. And so it's very different than an institution of higher ed. And so that's something that we often get questions on. Our candidates are just our candidates. It's who they hire. That is true. What is the district's hiring practices, and encouraging the district to have a diverse focus on their hiring practices? Our coaches and our mentors are just our coaches and our mentors. They're the people we have. They are the people you have to some extent. Now, if you can show that your coaches and mentors are no less diverse than your general teaching population, that's one thing. What if your coaches and mentors are much more homogeneous than your overall teaching force? That's then an issue. So looking at the comparative diversity across candidates, coaches, mentors, the teaching population, and the students is also an area I think that the second tier programs can definitely explore and look for evidence about this.
I'm going to do 2 induction specific questions to kind of follow on that. So there was a very quick question about for an induction program, is a site-based supervisor the same as a mentor? That's yes.
And the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
Because officially in a second tier program, those candidates don't have supervisors. A supervisor is the person that's there in the first tier program because the candidate is not licensed for the job that they are learning and doing. In all second tier programs, whether it's teaching or administration, the candidate is already licensed for that job. So they have coaches or mentors. So one way to say is they don't really have a site supervisor. They have a coach or mentor who fills a role similar to a site supervisor. But again, the coach and mentor never supervise or evaluate the candidate. They work with the candidate to help the candidate grow.
Okay. But for example, in standard 3, where it says site-based supervisors must be certified and experienced in teaching the specific content, I would assume that would also relate to the mentor having a credential match or coordinating that support.
It does, and I think that that is also addressed in the program standards and
Right.
the preconditions for each of those programs, where it even gets more specific, where it talks in special ed about the mentor must have a matching credential. So yes, I think Common Standard 3 is referring to those mentors and coaches in a similar way.
Okay. The other question was, Terry already brought it up a little bit too, was about admissions for induction programs. When there's questions about, what are the measures, how are you admitted? We understand that for induction programs, a lot of them, the requirement is that you accept all new hires, or all new teachers who need induction. So having those conversations with HR, with your district, you're taking that a step higher to how does the district think about recruiting for diversity? How does the district hire, and what are the measures that they use in hiring? Okay. There was a comment, please include common misunderstandings and omissions that you have observed. I think we've sort of done that throughout. So if you have other questions about specifics, let us know. But Cheryl's got an idea.
Yeah, well, no, what I was going to say on Common Standard 4, I think this is where we see the biggest omission. I think what happens is that there is in a level of informalness or informality, and what 4 really requires is a formal system. So I think it's really important that you make sure that it is a system where the data sources are articulated, that there is a process in place, and that the folks who, look at that data, that it happens on some sort of regular basis, as Erin mentioned when she was talking about this standard, that it really isn't, and you may be very small, and so it's easy to do it very informally, but make sure it's articulated how that happens. And I think that's probably one of our areas where there's the most omission, if you could say, that it's happening, but it's happening very informally.
Okay, I'm going to now follow that with, I got a question yesterday on Common Standard 4. So they're asking for specific examples of what does that graphic depiction of the unit assessment system look like, perhaps. That's the first part. And then the second part is, what are some of those data sources? It asks for an annotated list of data sources. What might those data sources be? So the two things. I think we did, but
I think we covered the data sources a little bit. I'm not sure who submitted this question, so maybe if you feel like the examples, if you're still not clear, perhaps you can chat back in. But I think we gave some good examples during the PowerPoint today. And then in terms of what does a graphic depiction look like, to some extent, that's up to you. But often what we'll see is, some kind of a cyclical graphic that talks about, this is where we're gathering it, this is where it's being assessed, and maybe there's some dates in there that go along with it. We don't have a specific sort of graphic example prepared, but Terry has something.
Would we actually accept, even though it's not a cyclical graphic, would we accept a table that has date, data source, when is it reviewed, who reviews it, and what happens is what we want to know also in Common Standard 5, but it through the table, it takes you through an annual cycle of all the data sources, where it comes from, who reviews it, when they review it, and what you do with it.
Absolutely. I think that would work perfectly fine. The one thing I did want to mention, though, is the who reviews. So remember, Common Standard 4 talks about the unit and the program. And I think there's a question or two about what's the unit. I think it's really important to know that the unit is above the program level. So everybody who is a program director reports to somebody, and that somebody is somebody at the institution is in charge of all the credential areas, even if those credential areas might be outside their direct supervision. So the, assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction might be the right unit head. So you want to make sure that the unit head is also involved in that review of the data. Now, that may not be on a regular day-to-day basis, but it should be on some sort of annual basis, semi-annual basis, so that the data is going above and beyond a program director to a unit level person. And that's really important at Common Standard 4. It's both at the unit and at the programs. So I would keep that in mind. Okay. And Terry.
Thinking back about what are some of the issues that we see related to the common standards, and Cheryl alluded to this, and if it was talked about in more depth earlier, I apologize, especially at some of our smaller institutions. And I know I heard Cheryl use the word insular. It can start to feel like everything happens within the institution. You have cooperating teachers, but every one of the cooperating teachers is one of your graduates. You have supervisors. Every supervisor is one of your graduates. You get input from a couple superintendents. They're all your graduates. That can start to feel a little bit insular. It doesn't mean it's necessarily not meeting the standards, but think broadly. Is there someone, and we don't want to say it, that hasn't drunk the Kool-Aid, but is there someone who is more of an external view? Because that starts to feel really very insular. I think Cheryl's word is actually completely perfect. That doesn't mean it's not good to have your own completers be your cooperating teachers. It is. But also look for additional resources, not just everybody who went through your program only.
And it's not just insular. I think you used this word earlier, and it's applicable here as well. Then it tends to become also very homogenous. If everybody sort of has the same voice, and the same background, and that's what they're bringing to the conversation, then you're not necessarily getting a good variety of sort of input and feedback from other folks, and that's really helpful.
All right. The next question was still related to Common Standard 4. This is an interesting question. So it says the standard asks for evidence about the extent to which candidates are prepared to enter the professional practice. So the question is, for an induction program, is this still applicable? The way I would see it is that, yes, we understand that they're already in professional practice because they are teaching, but it's, based on your program, how are they further now prepared to enter the practice? And if anyone else.
The old Common Standard, I think, used to say enter and continue in. So just read into there to enter the practice, but also to continue in and to become the educator and the leader of educators that we hope all effective educators are.
Great. The next question was about the credential recommendation process. So this is a very different topic, but the question was, in element 7 of program review, we already submitted a lot of information about the credential recommendation process. Are you looking for more here? This particular time, it's about the unit, not programs. So when you did it for program review, it was specific to the programs and how they do that. I realize it could be that you just have a one program institution, but this is looking for how does the unit monitor that process. So yes, we know that your process has it for your credential analyst, but also how does the entire unit know and be able to monitor that that's happening? So you are still submitting it, and it's not very much. It's just a brief description of it overall for the unit as to how you monitor that each program is effectively doing that. Okay, the next question is, if your program is so small that you don't get annual program completer data, are local surveys of induction cohort members sufficient? I'm going to let someone else answer this.
Yes.
All right, yeah,
Yes.
it's still good data.
Yes, there definitely is data. All data that you can validly, reliably collect and then analyze and then make sense of and describe. Remember, you're describing this to someone who does not live in your program or your institution. So you really have to tell them, what is the data saying to you and what are you doing about that?
Okay, the next question, when annotated lists are required, would it be best to list them by program or list them for the entire unit? That's okay. I really think you need to just make the decision as to what you think would be most friendly for the reviewer. So if you think it makes sense that the reviewer, it would be helpful to them to see it by program so that they can kind of keep track of what they're looking at, then yes, separate it by program. If not, yeah. So make the judgment as to what you think would be helpful for the reviewer. Otherwise, there's no hard and fast rule. Okay. I think Terry may have answered this, but I want to read it out loud anyway. What are some best practices for common standard submissions of institutions with multiple programs to improve reviewer ease?
Question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because I need to follow, even though she answered it by, what are some best practices for common standard submissions of institutions with multiple programs to improve the ease of the reviewers themselves?
And so I have responded through the chat line to a couple different things that have been going on there. And it really depends because a lot of the common standard is across your institution. There are some very specific elements that do talk. So we're looking on the slide at Common Standard 3, which we actually don't submit anything. Could we go to a Common Standard where we submit information? So going back to Common Standard 1 and the ideas in Common Standard 1, the concepts in Common Standard 1, one more back. There. Okay, qualifications of faculty and personnel. That's a great one because that differs across the programs. If you only have 2 programs, an alphabetical list may make a lot of sense. If you have 12 programs, that does not make sense. A list by program and then alphabetical within the program makes a lot of sense. Monitoring the credential recommendation process. If you have one process for your whole institution, that's great. You, though, might have an institution where one of the programs is outside the college and maybe it's a different process. Then you actually have to have a definition of the process that applies to all programs except the speech language pathology program, and the process that applies to the speech language pathology program. So the answer I put into the chat line was, if the information that you're submitting differs across the programs you offer, submit accurate information for all programs and clearly identify which program's information is this information and which program's information is this information. It also could have to do with the active involvement of the faculty, the personnel, and the stakeholders. There may be some differences in how that is done in some programs, things like that. So I always think it's a really good idea. Ask someone who does not know your program really well to look at what you're doing and saying, does this just make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you as a reader here? Because if they say, no, I don't know what those acronyms are. No, I don't know what you're talking about. That might be partly how the readers start out. Now, the readers will always persevere and try to get there, but be as clear as possible as you can in your submission.
I'm sorry, Cheryl, please.
I was just going to say, I think that's really important because when the reviewers at the site visit are making decisions on common standards, they're going to make sure that they have thought about every single one of these for every single program. So if there is a lack of information about one or two or three programs within your institution, it's really glaring and it can be a finding. So it's fine to admit differences. It's perfectly fine to have differences between programs and how you're meeting those standards, but they all should be incorporated within your common standards responses so that we can say, yeah, they've answered it for every program.
I just wanted to say in general for your submissions that if you're linking evidence that you do not have, it's not password protected, so that becomes a problem for reviewers if they can't access your documents, as well as if you're linking evidence that's, let's say, for example, like a handbook, but there's a specific part of the handbook that you want to be sure to reference that or bookmark it so that it directly links to the evidence within the handbook.
So I think what you're saying is if you're linking to a handbook, but you really want to get to a specific place, and let's say it's a 40-page handbook, try to make that link when you open it, it goes directly to page 23 in the handbook.
Yes, because reviewers there's so much information that they may miss that.
That's really important information. You want to make the readers work as little as they have to. I mean, they're going to be working hard, but you don't want them going on a treasure hunt. You really want to be able to say, this is how we do it, and here's our evidence. And so it's really easy for them to kind of make that connection. Any other questions while we're here?
The last question we had, and this is also one where Terry jumped in and wrote something on there, but it's still important especially if you're not looking at the chat, was, do we incorporate our program review feedback, which we may or may not have, into our common standards submission? Erin.
So I will say that it's unlikely that you are going to have your program review feedback before your common standards submission comes in. It is possible, but we have to get all of the programs read before we start sending the feedback back to the institutions. Because of the way program review occurs, we don't, for instance, read all of the programs at one institution at one program review session. We just have to get the reviewers we can that are paired with the right expertise together to read those. So, if you have a number of programs, we're doing program review up to at least January 14th. And if I continue to have programs that are still not read, then I'm going to try to have to do those on a one-on-one basis. So we won't be sending that back until we have all of it completed. If we can get that back to you before Common Standards review, that'll be great. But you're probably already working on your Common Standards submissions. So I wouldn't wait for that.
You really don't need to. There really isn't a need to do that. by the time you get to the site visit, your review team will have access to your full accreditation website, which will include your program review, all of the feedback, your addendums, as well as your common standards addendum, and the feedback, and your preconditions and all the other things that are helpful for the team. So, Michelle, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, so there was one last question about password protecting different documents, etc. So the overall message is make sure there's not a separate password. If you have a password for the overall website, that's fine. But once the reviewers are in and they click on different links, make sure there are no additional passwords. So there's one last question. Oh, so go ahead and Cheryl, and then the next question. So again, to Common Standard 1 credential monitoring. Yeah, so the monitoring process, and this is specifically from an induction program. So so the point in this one is to make sure that, so Common Standard 1, the last element is about monitoring the credential process. Question is, what should this look like? So in general, this talks about how do you monitor that process is taking place. So yes, in program review, there was a lot of detail about what happens and how the recommendation process happens. This specifically is asking for a short description, 200 words, talking about how do you monitor, how does the unit leadership monitor that process that you laid out is actually happening and is correct.
It's possible that it's the same language you use to submit in the program.
Exactly. It might be the same.
Standard. It's perfectly fine. What we're trying to find out is we want assurance that those who are recommended for a credential are in fact those that have completed the program and all requirements that need to be submitted. As you probably know, here with CTC Online, there is no back check. I mean, there might be something that pops up, but there really isn't. So we need to make sure through the accreditation process that you are monitoring and making sure that only those who have completed the program and only those who should be getting the credentials actually are being recommended for the credential. It's a very important clause in Common Standard 1, and we will have interviews set up with your credential analysts and your program directors and anybody else who has that information. We're not dictating how that is to be done, but making sure that there are appropriate checks and balances on the process and making sure that, those who need to sign off have signed off, those kinds of things. So you tell us how it's done at your institution. So any other questions that are in the chat?
No, there's no other questions in the chat or by email. So.
Okay, and then I had promised that we would open it up if anybody else has questions now. The question is, what do I need to do? Stop sharing?
No, they would just need to unmute themselves
Okay.
and they could ask a question.
Okay.
So
I guess I'll give a moment
Yeah.
at this point in time if anybody has any final questions, because we don't want to leave you hanging. And again, remember we have the PSD read at ctc.ca.gov
Yep.
that you can always follow up between now and the end of February with any questions. So any questions? I guess just jump in. Using appropriate wait time.
All right.
Does it sound great? Okay, great. So thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And again, please reach out if you have any questions at all. We're happy to help. Have a wonderful day and see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.